A racist cop arrests a black man, thinking he's just another suspect. But when he finds out the man is a state lawyer, everything changes, and what happens next will leave you in awe. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hum of passing cars. The streets of Wellington Heights, a wealthy suburban neighborhood, were pristine, lined with towering oak trees and sprawling mansions. It was the kind of place where an unfamiliar face, especially a black one, stood out like a beacon. Marcus Carter kept his hands firmly on the wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, his breathing slow and measured. He had just finished a long day at the courthouse, wrapping up a case that had taken weeks of meticulous work. He was exhausted, but more than that, he was familiar with this feeling, the creeping tension of being a black man driving through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Then, the telltale flash of red and blue lights. He exhaled sharply. Here we go again. In his rearview mirror, he saw the squad car pull up behind him. The officer inside hadn't even run his plates yet, but Marcus already knew what this was. He could feel it in his gut. Officer Brad Mitchell stepped out of his patrol car, moving with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked authority. He was built like a linebacker, his uniform tight against his burly frame, his movements stiff with the illusion of self-importance. As he approached, his hand rested on the holster of his gun, not unclipped, but ready. Marcus kept his composure, reaching for his glove compartment slowly. A deliberate, practiced movement, one he had perfected over years of learning how not to be seen as a threat. Before he could even touch the latch, Brad barked, "Hands where I can see them." Marcus froze. License and registration. "Now," Brad demanded, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus swallowed his irritation. "I am reaching for it now, officer. Just hurry up." Brad's flashlight beamed into Marcus's car, scanning the spotless leather interior, the polished dashboard, the expensive watch glinting on Marcus's wrist. His lips curled slightly. Luxury car. Late at night. Black guy. "Yeah, this one's dirty." Marcus handed over his documents, watching as Brad barely glanced at them. His mind was already made up. "You live around here?" Brad asked, the accusation barely concealed. "Is that relevant to why I was pulled over?" Brad's jaw tightened. "You are asking too many questions for someone who should be cooperating." A dull throb started behind Marcus's eyes. He had handled men like Brad in the courtroom, arrogant, trigger-happy officers who thrived on power and control. But out here, in the dark, with no robe, no jury, no gavel, only the weight of Brad's authority pressing down on him, his options were limited. Stay calm, stay composed. "I would just like to know why I was stopped," Marcus said evenly. Brad's eyes darkened. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated. He had done nothing wrong. Brad's hand moved to his gun. "I said step out of the car. Now." Marcus's heart pounded, but he complied. He kept his hands visible, moving slowly, deliberately. As soon as he stood, Brad grabbed him by the shoulder and shoved him against the hood. The cold metal pressed against Marcus's chest. His breath caught as tight metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. Brad yanked the cuffs harder than necessary, making sure Marcus felt it. Marcus winced. "Was that really necessary?" Brad smirked. "What's wrong?" "Too tight." Nearby, the faint glow of a cell phone screen flickered. A woman, standing on the sidewalk, was recording. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Marcus heard it clearly. "Oh, he has no idea who he just arrested." Brad ignored her, too caught up in his moment of victory. "Bet you think you're some big shot, huh? Let me guess, you got warrants, maybe some drugs in the trunk." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Actually, officer, I am." "Shut up." Brad cut him off. "You can explain yourself at the station." Marcus stared ahead, his face unreadable. Because Brad had just made the biggest mistake of his career. At the police station, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the booking desk. Brad dragged Marcus through the entrance, shoving him toward the holding area. The other officers barely looked up, used to seeing Brad bring in suspects with the same aggressive energy. Marcus maintained his composure, his face unreadable, but as soon as they reached the desk sergeant, he finally spoke, clearly, firmly, with authority. "I am a state prosecutor. "You just made a very big mistake." Silence fell. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged officer with graying hair, looked up from his paperwork. His eyes flickered between Marcus and Brad, confusion crossing his features. Brad scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Nice try. You expect me to believe that?" The sergeant frowned and reached for Marcus's wallet. He pulled out Marcus's ID and scanned it. Then, he froze. "Brad." His voice was tight. "We have a problem." Brad's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Before the sergeant could answer, the police captain burst through the doors. His face was pale, his eyes darting between Marcus and Brad. "Mitchell." His voice was sharp. "You just arrested one of the most powerful attorneys in the state." Brad's confidence wavered. He resisted. He was being uncooperative. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his tone measured but lethal. "Your body cam footage will say otherwise. Check it." Brad stiffened. His body cam was still recording. The room was deathly silent as the captain grabbed the device and replayed the footage. The crackling sound of Brad's voice filled the air, each arrogant word now working against him. The forceful orders, the illegal search, the racial profiling, the unnecessary aggression. Brad's fate was sealed. Marcus Carter had spent his entire life fighting against a system that was designed to work against him. He had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do, how a single accusation, a single moment of bias, could destroy an innocent man's life. As a child he had watched his father, a hard-working mechanic and devoted family man, get stopped by police so many times that it became an expectation, not a possibility. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus was 9 years old when the police burst into their home, guns drawn, shouting orders. His father barely had time to process the accusation. Armed robbery, a crime he never committed. The case against his father was built on thin air, a so-called eyewitness, a vague description, and a police force eager for a quick arrest. The truth did not matter. His father was black, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was enough. Marcus never forgot the sound of the judge's gavel when his father was sentenced to 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The system had failed his father, but Marcus refused to let it fail him. Fueled by rage, grief, and a determination that burned like fire, he worked his way through law school, knowing that his purpose was clear: to fight for the falsely accused. Now, as a state prosecutor, he did not just enforce the law, he held those who abused it accountable. And tonight, he was about to do just that. Officer Brad Mitchell never questioned his authority, because no one ever had. His father had been a cop. His grandfather had been a cop. The Mitchells had been in law enforcement for generations, and with that came an unspoken rule. The job was not about justice. It was about control. Brad had grown up watching his father laugh over beers with other officers, bragging about how he could make any suspect cooperate with the right amount of force. His family dinner conversations were filled with stories about how black men were always up to something, how it was just common sense to stop them first, ask questions later. Brad learned early on that complaints meant nothing. He had 4 excessive force complaints in the last 3 years, all swept under the rug. Every time a suspect tried to file a report, it magically disappeared before an investigation could even start. To him, racial profiling was not wrong. It was efficient. And tonight was just another routine stop. Another black man in a nice car. Another criminal, most likely. What he did not know was that this one would not stay silent. What he did not know was that this arrest would cost him everything. The paths of Marcus Carter and Brad Mitchell had been set in motion long before tonight. One man spent his life trying to fix a broken system. The other had spent his life abusing it. And now, in a small holding cell at the police station, their fates were about to collide with consequences neither of them saw coming. The harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Brad Mitchell dragged Marcus Carter through the station, his grip on the cuffs unnecessarily tight. Brad wanted to make a show of this arrest. He shoved Marcus forward, forcing him into a metal bench in the holding area. The loud clank of the handcuffs against the cold steel echoed through the room. Other officers turned to watch. Some smirked, others remained silent, their gazes unreadable. Brad stepped back, arms crossed, chest puffed out with satisfaction. He had done this 100 times before, bringing in a so-called suspect for questioning. Most of them knew better than to fight back. But this one was arrogant. Brad sneered. You think you are special, huh? Wearing a suit, driving that car. That does not change a damn thing. You are just another thug pretending to be important. Marcus, still calm, looked up at him, eyes sharp, unwavering. Then he spoke clearly for the first time. I am a state prosecutor. You just made a very big mistake. Silence. The air in the room shifted. A nearby officer froze mid-step. The desk sergeant, who had been filing paperwork, snapped his head up so fast his pen clattered to the floor. Brad chuckled, shaking his head. Nice try. You expect me to believe that? Marcus did not flinch. He just held his gaze. The desk sergeant, face suddenly pale, reached for the computer. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed in Marcus Carter's name. The screen loaded for a moment too long, and then there it was. The sergeant's eyes went wide. His voice, usually gruff and indifferent, wavered. Brad, we have a problem. Brad's smirk faltered. The heavy office doors burst open, and in strode Captain Harris, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, but when his eyes landed on Marcus, his entire face lost color. His gaze snapped to Brad. Mitchell, you just arrested one of the most powerful attorneys in the state. The words hit Brad like a brick to the chest. For the first time tonight, uncertainty crept into his features. Still, he clung to his bravado. He resisted. He was being uncooperative. Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Your body cam footage will say otherwise. Check it. A beat of silence. Brad stiffened. His mouth opened, but no words came. Because he knew, the body cam had been running the entire time. Every insult, every unnecessary use of force, every illegal action, all of it was recorded. Captain Harris's expression darkened as he motioned for an officer to retrieve the footage. The station was now deathly silent. No one spoke as the footage played. Every officer in the room watched in stunned silence as Brad's voice echoed back at them. Bet you think you are some big shot, huh? Let me guess. You got warrants. Shut up. You can explain yourself at the station. Then came the clear evidence of excessive force. Brad shoving Marcus onto the hood of his car, tightening the cuffs deliberately, smirking as Marcus winced. The tension in the room thickened. Brad's face drained of color. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he said nothing. Captain Harris exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Then his voice came out firm, unrelenting. Mitchell, take off your badge. Now. Brad staggered back. Wait, Captain. Now. The once proud officer stood frozen, reality crashing down around him. Marcus watched without gloating, without smirking, just steady, unshaken, because this was not just about him. This was about every man who never got justice. And Brad's fate was sealed. The air in the precinct was thick with tension. The fallout from Brad Mitchell's unjust arrest of Marcus Carter had sent shockwaves through the station. And no one knew what would happen next. Marcus sat calmly, in a chair across from Captain Harris, his wrists now free, but his resolve stronger than ever. Across the room, Brad stood frozen, his badge confiscated, his career hanging by a thread. Then the police chief arrived. Chief Langston, a stocky man with graying hair, entered with an expression of barely contained frustration. His eyes darted to Marcus, then to Brad, then back again. Let us keep this internal, Marcus, Langston said, his voice low, measured. We do not need the media involved. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He leaned forward, his voice calm, but razor-sharp. That is the problem, he said. You protect men like him. Langston sighed, rubbing his temples. I understand you are upset, but Mitchell, he made a mistake. We can handle this without making a public spectacle. Marcus scoffed. A mistake? You think this was just a mistake? Do you know how many men like me do not walk away from encounters like this? His voice rose slightly, controlled but laced with fire. And if I were not a state prosecutor, what then? Langston did not answer. But then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the silence. Sir, I have seen Brad do this too many times. All heads turned. Officer Jamie Rodriguez stood near the back of the room, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. He was young, late 20s, fresh-faced, nervous but resolute. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and his voice was steady, though there was a slight tremble in it. Marcus studied him carefully. Langston narrowed his eyes. Rodriguez, what are you talking about? Jamie swallowed hard, then spoke. Brad thinks he is untouchable. He glanced at Marcus before looking back at his superiors. This is not the first time he has done this. He stops black men for no reason all the time. Sometimes he lets them go. Sometimes. Jamie trailed off, his jaw clenching. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And you are only speaking up now? Jamie hesitated. I wanted to before, I should have. But speaking out against one of our own, Marcus interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. Is the reason officers like Brad keep doing this? Jamie nodded slowly. Langston shifted uncomfortably. Rodriguez, are you prepared to put this in writing? Jamie's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. But then he nodded. Yes, sir, and I have something else. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a flash drive. I have been collecting evidence for months. Langston's face drained of color. Jamie set the drive on the table. Body cam footage. Dash cam recordings. Complaints that never made it to the official reports. His voice was strong now. Brad did not just pick the wrong guy tonight. He has been doing this for years, and I am done staying quiet about it. Marcus finally had everything he needed. This was not just about his own wrongful arrest anymore. This was about every victim who never got justice. And now, the entire department was about to face the truth. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the aisles. Cameras lined the back wall, and legal analysts whispered fervently among themselves. The case had exploded onto national news, fueling debates about police accountability, racial profiling, and systemic abuse. At the defense table, Brad Mitchell sat stiffly in a dark suit, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with resentment. He had once strutted through precinct halls with unchecked arrogance. Now he was the one in handcuffs. At the prosecution table, Marcus Carter sat with unwavering focus, his expression unreadable. He had fought for justice before, but this time, it was personal. The state had wasted no time filing charges against Brad. Abuse of power, false arrest, excessive force and misconduct. The case was airtight, and it was about to get even worse for Brad. The prosecution's first witness, Officer Jamie Rodriguez. Jamie stood tall, though a nervous tremor edged his voice. He looked Brad in the eye as he spoke, exposing the deep-seated corruption within the department. I have witnessed Officer Mitchell engage in racially motivated stops on multiple occasions, Jamie said, his voice growing stronger.
I reported it to my superiors. Nothing happened. Every complaint against him vanished. The jury leaned in, their eyes locked onto the young officer. How many complaints were dismissed? The prosecutor asked. Jamie exhaled. At least 30. A ripple of gasps moved through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel for silence. Jamie continued, voice steady. The truth is Brad Mitchell was never held accountable. The department covered for him. Until now. The prosecution laid out case after case, presenting evidence of dozens of black men arrested under eerily similar circumstances. No justifiable cause for the stops. Body cam footage showing clear racial bias, mark threats, coercion, and excessive force. One by one, victims stepped forward, recounting their experiences. A father pulled over while driving his daughter to school, handcuffed in front of her. A college student mistaken for a suspect, beaten, detained, released with no explanation. Mark, a war veteran, accused of acting suspicious, humiliated for daring to question his arrest. Each testimony was another nail in Brad's coffin. The once confident officer, now sat slumped in his chair, his face pale. When Brad finally took the stand, his arrogance had cracked, but not completely shattered.
I was just doing my job, he insisted, voice tight with frustration. I never targeted anyone based on race. The prosecutor did not even blink. Then why do all your victims look the same? Brad floundered. He shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. It was a coincidence. A harsh silence followed. Then the prosecutor played the final piece of evidence, Brad's own words caught on body cam. Bet you think you're some big shot, huh? Let me guess. You got warrants. Shut up. You can explain yourself at the station. The words hung in the air like a noose. Brad's mouth clamped shut. He had nothing left to say. Marcus stood, buttoned his suit, and faced the jury. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. If I were not a lawyer, I would be another statistic. Silence. How many more men like me are out there, but do not have a voice? How many innocent lives have been ruined because an officer, one who swore to protect and serve, believed that the color of their skin was evidence enough of guilt? A juror wiped her eyes. This is not just about me. This is about every man who sat in a cell, knowing he did nothing wrong. Every family who lost a loved one to a system designed to silence them. Every voice that was ignored because no one was willing to listen. He let the weight of his words settle before finishing. Today you have the power to say enough. He stepped back. The courtroom held its breath. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood, cleared his throat, and read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Brad visibly deflated, his hands clenched into fists, as the reality of his downfall sank in. Marcus exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they burned with the satisfaction of justice finally served. Brad Mitchell was no longer above the law, and for once the system had worked the way it was supposed to. As Brad was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters swarmed outside, microphones flashing. Marcus stepped onto the courthouse steps, facing the sea of cameras. A reporter called out, "Mr. Carter, do you have any final words?" Marcus looked directly into the camera. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. Because the fight for justice was far from over. The metal of the handcuffs clinked against each other as Brad Mitchell was led out of the courtroom, his head hanging low. His once proud stride was reduced to a walk of shame, his badge already stripped from him, his future crumbling with every step. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters shoving microphones forward, eager for a statement. Former Officer Brad Mitchell, any comments on the verdict? Do you believe you were treated unfairly? Brad said nothing. There was nothing left to say. For years he had operated without consequences, a man who believed he was untouchable. But now, he was just another criminal, and Marcus Carter had made sure of it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was buzzing with energy. Activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens stood together, holding signs that read, "Justice for the wrongfully accused. Hold corrupt cops accountable. No more silent victims." Marcus Carter stepped out into the daylight, his suit perfectly pressed, but the exhaustion in his eyes was undeniable. A swarm of reporters turned to him instantly. "Mr. Carter, are you satisfied with today's verdict?" He paused. The truth was there was no real victory here. Justice in one case had been served. But what about the countless others? He lifted his gaze, staring directly into the cameras. "This is not just about me," he said, voice strong, unwavering. "This is about justice for all those who never got a fair chance. Those who did not have a camera to prove their innocence. Those whose stories never made the news." The crowd fell silent. "How many more?" Marcus asked, his tone heavy with meaning. "How many more men like me have suffered in silence? How many more have been falsely accused, humiliated, or even killed, without ever getting their day in court?" The cameras zoomed in on his face. Justice is not just a courtroom victory. Justice is changing the system, so that no one else has to go through what I did. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People nodded, whispered, clapped. Because they knew the fight was far from over. Later that evening, As the city buzzed with discussions of the trial, Marcus Carter found himself standing in front of an old, weathered gravestone. His father's name was etched into the stone, the letters worn from time. He knelt down, placing a single white flower on the grave. "This one was for you, Dad." The words were soft, almost swallowed by the wind. For years, Marcus had been haunted by the injustice that stole his father's freedom. For years, he had carried that pain. Today, he had fought back, but the victory was bittersweet. Justice for one man would never erase the thousands who had suffered before him. It would never bring back the lives stolen by the system. But it was a start, and he would keep fighting. For his father, for himself, for every innocent soul who never got the chance. As the camera faded out on Marcus standing at his father's grave, one final message appeared on the screen. How many more people have to suffer before we demand change? Let us talk in the comments. Share this story. Be part of the movement. Justice is not a privilege. It is a right. The screen faded to black, but the conversation, it was just beginning.